And will not God, dot, dot, dot. And will not God, these 4 simple words beginning a single sentence in one small section of Luke's gospel, they become a call for God's justice, echoing throughout time and place. This parable today isn't unique, though. We find a similar parable in Luke 11 as well, where Jesus tells a parable about a man begging for food to give to an unexpected guest who comes to his house in the middle of the night. And that parable in Luke 11 told of a man who goes in the middle of the night to a friend, asking his friend for bread to feed a house guest. And in that parable, the friend didn't want to get out of bed, didn't want to be bothered at all in the middle of the night and provide anything to help. But because the man knocked and knocked and knocked, he wore down his friend, who eventually relented and got out of bed and gave bread to the man. And in this parable today, we see a judge who also doesn't want to be bothered to help out a widow in need of legal help and justice. So in these parables, I think a lot of questions need to be asked if we are to examine the gospel faithfully. Who is God in the parable? Is God the friend who didn't want to be bothered in the middle of the night to help someone in need? Is God the unjust judge who refused to give justice to a poor widow who came to him begging and pleading? What do these parables tell us about God? Well, thankfully, the answer to all of those questions is no. No, God is not like these examples of people who didn't want to be bothered by someone in need. And thankfully, in Luke 18 today, the answer that we do get is this: and will not God grant justice to his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? This is a parable today of contrasts, a parable of juxtapositions. We have a poor widow, a woman alone and without a voice in the society that she lives in. And then we have a judge, a man of power and influence and notoriety. A corrupt judge, though, who doesn't seem to care about dispensing justice, especially to a marginalized woman. And it's tempting, I think, to simplify this gospel, give it a quick look, and to read into it the things that we may want it to say. Maybe we see ourselves as that widow, that lonely widow, begging, pleading for somebody, anybody, to give us help in time of need, someone to give us justice, someone to listen, someone to come to our aid. And maybe we also see God as that unjust judge, a divine being that will only heed our call if we bother him enough. But is that really what we believe about God? And so I think we look at this parable and maybe we become a little bit disillusioned, because Jesus says that this parable is what prayer is like. And that doesn't make any sense to us. Why pray at all if we're just bothering God until he finally gives in and helps us? And we become jaded too, because we've all been this widow, haven't we? We too have felt the sting of calling out to God, waiting on an answer that has yet to come. And we become disillusioned because faith in an unseen God is difficult, I think, to hold on to. Disillusioned until perhaps we hear those 4 words, and And will not God? That sentence is the key factor to this whole parable that Jesus tells us. It tells us that indeed God is nothing like an unjust judge. It tells us that God is not like us, flawed people. God is not selfish, is not lacking compassion, is not unforgiving and petty. God doesn't feel bothered when we come to God with our needs. And that's good news. But yet, what you don't need to hear today is to hold on, to have faith, and to not lose hope. Because you have faith. You all have faith, expectant faith, a faith that brought you to worship today, a faith that's guided your lives. And what Jesus or I might tell you to pray continually and to not lose heart, well, that likely might sound like an empty platitude to you. Because we've all prayed for a loved one to live, and then they died. We've all prayed for healing to come, and it didn't. We prayed for a marriage to be saved, and it ended. So a parable like this, I think, makes us all wonder, why pray at all? Why pray at all? It's a question I've asked myself many times, and it's okay to ask. But yet I find an ironic twist in the parable today. What I expect to hear is to simply ask God for help, and he'll gladly give it. I expect to hear that I can immediately go to God with my needs, and he will quickly provide whatever I ask for. That's what I expect this parable, and maybe the Bible, to tell me. But what this gospel text tells us instead is to demand that God give us justice, to demand that God right the wrongs that we face, to demand that God will make the unholy holy, to demand that God will take what's broken and make it whole again. And this gospel text tells us that we need to demand all of that of God, boldly. And I think that prayer is the only way that we can demand these things of God. And will not God? It's no coincidence that Jesus uses a widow in the parable today. He could have used someone of influence, someone with connection, someone with wealth. But no, the one who is demanding an answer is a widow, a voiceless member of society, someone abandoned by family, and we know that because she had no one else to advocate for her. Someone with no social standing, a marginalized woman. Someone who obviously had to beg and plead to get any kind of legal help. And God uses a widow to show who Jesus most identifies with. Think about that. Jesus knows what it is to be voiceless and alone and even abandoned. Jesus knows what it feels like to cry out to God for help. And yet, Jesus knew that he was never alone or abandoned. So today, and every day, when you feel lacking in faith, when you feel full of doubt, and we all do, when you've pleaded and begged and still God seems silent, know that you're not alone. Jesus, too, has felt this way. And that is exactly why he tells all of us to demand much of God, to expect much of God, because God is still listening. and because God will do more for us than we can expect or imagine. May we believe that. May we live into that in faith.